everyone. A very good evening to those from Singapore and the Asia Pacific, and a very good morning to those in Europe and for the rest of the world. Thank you for tuning in to our webinar today. Our topic today that we are covering is on how the flexibility of ethical principles can empower eye care providers, applications to conducting research and implementing innovative treatments. We are from the Center for Innovation and Precision Eye Health, Yong Loo School of Medicine in Singapore. My name is David, and I'm a consultant ophthalmologist from the Department of Ophthalmology in National University Hospital, Singapore. I'm trained as a cataract and refractive surgeon, but I also am the co-lead of the Center for Innovation and Precision Eye Health under Pillar 2, which is Community Eye Care. In this pillar, we develop devices to perform community-based eye screening for our patients. And in that process, we often encounter scenarios where we have to actually use these devices for patients, and some of these devices could be before they are actually regulatory approved. So sometimes this can provide a bit of ethical challenge. And so today, I'm very pleased to be joined by two excellent speakers. Our main speaker today is Professor Jerry Menikoff. Dr. Jerry Menikoff is a professor of bioethics in the Center for Biomedical Ethics and also in the Department of Ophthalmology. He is also a senior fellow of the Faculty of Law at the National University of Singapore. He received a joint degree and Master of Public Policy from Harvard University, and also an MD from Washington University, St. Louis, USA, with an ophthalmology residency at the New York Eye and Ear Infirmary. Prior to joining NUS Singapore, for 14 years, he served as the director of the main US regulatory agency protecting research of subjects in federally funded research, known as the Office for Human Research Protections, or OHRP. This organization directly regulates the National Institute of Health of the United States. Through his tenure, he oversaw the multi-year process of successfully revising a set of federal regulations known as the Common Rule, which regulations have served as the template for the rules in countries all around the world, including Singapore. Many of the changes there reflected proposals that he promoted for years, such as improving consent forms, making consent forms public, and requiring a single institutional review board for review of multi-center research. In addition, he also played a lead role in creating the debate over determining the risk level in comparative effectiveness research, most notably relating to issues raised in the support trial of oxygen supplementation in premature infants to reduce retinopathy of prematurity. Prior to joining OHRP, he was also in charge of the Intramural Human Research Protection Program at the NIH. In addition, he also has academic appointments, being a faculty member of medical and law schools at the University of Kansas and the University of Chicago, among other schools. As an academic physician, he has authored many articles in journals, such as the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, The Lancet, and also written two books, one called Law and Bioethics, an Introduction, published by Georgetown University Press, and the second one called What the Doctor Didn't Say, The Hidden Truth About Medical Research, published by Oxford University Press. It's a very long title and also a very long biography in his illustrious career. I'm also joined today by Dr. Marcus Tan, who is our department's consultant glaucomatologist and also is the Deputy Group Chief Technology Officer from NUHS. Sorry, I had a comment that cannot really hear. I'll try to speak up a little bit. Thank you. So the comment chat box, you can type in your comments and questions anytime during the speech and the lecture. For today's topic, we are going to talk about the different ethical principles that apply when the clinicians move away from providing standard of care treatments. This includes providing innovative treatments or conducting research, because sometimes this can be confusing to clinicians. The confusion itself can become a barrier for healthcare providers in furthering their research. So in this webinar, Prof Menikoff will discuss how a better understanding of the ethical principles in innovation and research in particular can empower the clinicians instead of hampering them. Through his experience from running these prominent regulatory agencies in the US, he will demonstrate and apply these concepts to various eye care scenarios, including the development of artificial intelligence and innovative treatments for myopia. Over to you, Prof Menikoff.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Welcome, everybody. It's a great privilege. You've had such stellar speakers, cutting-edge researchers in prior versions of this webinar, and I'm not in their league, but in any event, I'm very pleased to be here. So let me share my screen, and okay, see if we get this. Okay, so hopefully that's working.
Perfect.
Okay. Okay, so here's my agenda for today. I want to talk about, in fact, about the first half or so of the talk will be about the line between doing research versus providing non-standard care. I think it's an understanding that actually helps you appreciate why we have rules for protecting participants in research. And in fact, eye care professionals have played a major role in sort of helping us delineate that line. Then the other four topics here are somewhat related, but a little different, and they're more about cutting edge research that largely involves secondary use of data and biospecimens. So we'll talk about merging data sets, and all of these will involve to some degree issues relating to when you do or do not need consent. Number three, research use of biospecimens without consent. For role of IRBs, research ethics committees in creating policies. And number five, cluster randomized trials and consent. So I'm going to start out on the first topic with this case study. And so let's start thinking about, well, how do you do a corneal transplant, full thickness corneal transplant? And based on how we do it now, how might we improve that procedure? Here's a tree fine. Sure, lots of listeners are familiar with this. Just a little sort of cookie cutter sort of device that cuts out the corneal button from the deceased patient's cornea that is then going to be used in the recipient's eye. And this is showing you kind of how well this works. On the left, you have a very edematous cornea. A person cannot see well at all out of that eye. And then after the corneal transplant on the right, you see a cornea that's been sutured in from the donor eye, and it's clear, and hopefully that person will have very, very good vision. So what I've described here is a version of standard care for doing a corneal transplant. And we're going to talk a lot here about how important it is to understand the role of standard care versus other types of care you could be providing. So to say more about the case I'm going to talk about, in the late 1990s, there was an ophthalmologist, we'll refer to him as Dr. R, and he proposed a method to improve penetrating keratoplasty. And in particular, he was proposing to reduce the time, which would save time in an operating room, save lots of money. And also he claimed it would improve the results of the patients, that they would actually see better sooner. Both would be wonderful things. He called it a sutureless corneal transplant technique. I got a US patent, and the patent basically said, this involves a technique for transplanting corneal tissue in a much safer way with far less complications than previous methods. And this is from the patent application. It's showing you what he was actually proposing to do. And the key thing here was actually in terms of designing the tree fine. He actually ended up having engineers who used to work on nuclear bombs and were unemployed from doing that, and they managed to do this amazing thing. So at the top, you have the corneal button. This is, the way you'd cut it out from the donor, and the bottom is the recipient's eye with the hole cut in it that you will place the corneal button in. And the new thing here was that the tree fine would put these little tabs that you see, the 4 tabs on top. It would cut those out as part of the corneal button. And the way I think of it, it is sort of like, if, I don't know if they still have this, what we'd call like paper dolls, at least back in the US. You take the paper dolls and put the little tabs on the clothing into the slits. So what he was proposing was, on the corneal button, you would, well, first with a suture, you would kind of, first with a scalpel, you'll make these little, slits in the recipient's eyeball in their cornea, and then you'd plop the button in, and you'd kind of put the little tabs into the slits. And his proposal was, well, you don't need any sutures. You just kind of go ahead and do that. And it sounds pretty amazing. Well, so what actually happened, he studied it initially in cats. He began using it in people, but he never obtained review by an institutional review board, research ethics committee. He ended up having this got reported in a major newspaper in the US in 2001. And here's part of the headline, or the major part of the story. In 1994, an eye surgeon invented a medical device that he thought would revolutionize corneal transplantation surgery, make millions of dollars. It did neither. Instead, it cost him his high-paying university job and led to US government findings that he performed unapproved research on more than 60 people, including children. Um, the US, in particular, the US Office for Human Research Protections, OHRP. This was the office I ended up running, but it was years after that, so I wasn't involved at this point. It investigated what he did and issued its conclusions in 2000, and it basically said Dr. R had proposed a randomized controlled trial, though he never actually conducted it, but he proposed one. He wrote it up. He used an untested new technique in 60 people, presented abstracts at meetings, and according to OHRP, this constituted a systematic collection of data, effectively a sort of an open label trial, and thus, according to that agency, met the definition of conducting research. And we'll go into exactly what the definition requires, and therefore you need an IRB review, and he never got it. So he basically violated the rules protecting research participants. It required some remediation, and in particular, his institution was required to tell all his patients that they had been research subjects and had been exposed to an experimental surgery, which of course didn't make his institution particularly happy. In the US, we have lots of lawyers, and this is sort of a bad thing that you don't want this sort of thing to be announced to members of the public. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about his defense to this, because he basically said he didn't create the problem that this agency was saying he created. And in particular, he said he wasn't doing research. He said the technique was never used on my patients as part of any systematic investigation. Under the US rules, a physician is doing research when they're conducting, just getting into the formal definitions here, a systematic investigation designed to develop generalizable knowledge. Important thing to note, this is pretty much exactly the concept, the definition of research that's used in Singapore. So the key question to ask is, when you're trying to figure out if something involves research, what activities is it that the physician or the other healthcare provider is conducting that are not fully justified by the goal of doing what is best for the patient? If you're just doing things to care for the patient, then you're probably not doing research. You have to be doing something beyond that that meets this definition of being a systematic investigation to produce generalizable knowledge. So it's always an issue of what things did you do that, again, were not for purposes of treating the patient, but for purposes of learning how to best treat future patients. And so let's explore that. And so the big picture I'm going to talk about here is, imagine there are three categories that we want to plop a particular activity into. We've already talked about standard care. In this case, it's the usual way you would do a corneal transplant. In category 3, there's the notion of doing research, meeting that definition, which we already described. And what I want to particularly talk about is, often it gets lost, this notion of a middle category of being on the clinical side. So you're not doing research, but you're not providing standard care. So it's the notion of providing non-standard care. Again, non-standard care on the clinical side of things. And that's what we'll sort of get into here. So in this big picture, instead of there being just two categories, providing standard care versus doing research, we have this middle third category, and that's what I'll be talking about a fair amount in the next few minutes. And in particular, if you understand these three categories, then you actually can have a better understanding to think about, well, why do we have all these rules regulating research, and in particular protecting research participants? So to ease us into thinking that way, let's think about these 2 points. When people are investigating what Dr. R did, there seemed to be a lot of push to find out, to conclude that he was doing research. And some people seem to think, well, if he wasn't found to be doing research, there weren't any restrictions on his ability to do this sort of thing, that there'd be a hole in the rules. And so I want to explore that. So let's imagine, that what was an issue here was he did too many research-like things, and that put him on the side of the line that he was doing research. And let's imagine in an alternative version of what happened, he didn't do so many research-like things. He didn't write it up as a research study. He didn't present it at meetings, things like that, okay? He didn't analyze data, didn't submit abstracts, etc. Suppose he told his patients this was a new experimental technique, but he thought it was their best option in terms of clinical care. He might have done that, and let's assume he successfully did so much of that, that he was viewed as not being on the side of doing research, but rather that middle number 2 category of being in the clinical setting, but providing non-standard care, because clearly what he did wasn't standard care, okay? So, right, what if he successfully did that? Would he have been better off? And so was his main problem just that he was careless and did too many research-like things, pushing what he did into this category of research when he needn't have gotten it into that category? So that's what I want to explore here. And to explore that, I want to talk about this other physician, Robert Truog, and very famous bioethicist. He's also on the Harvard Medical School faculty as an anesthesiologist. And so back in 1999, he had a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine. And in that piece, he talks about a paradox. And this is paraphrased, but here's what he's talking about. And this was not new to him. Actually, other people had written about it. Imagine a physician reads in some medical journal about a new treatment, and the notion is, well, now that they've learned about this, they can now start using it on their patients merely by getting their general consent. General consent meaning you tell them about it, and you don't actually even need to type up a new type of consent form or anything like that, like you would in the research setting. Whereas contrast that with if you have a physician who wants to do research on the treatment to actually do what we think is a good thing and mainly see if it's actually effective or has appropriate risks. So maybe they want to do a randomized trial. Instead of getting general consent, they have to prepare a formal protocol. They have to obtain approval from this type of review committee, an institutional review board. They have to seek written informed consent from potential participants. So what Dr. Truog was thinking, this sounds very strange. A physician could do almost anything they want in the name of therapeutic innovation, but only if there's no attempt to gain systematic knowledge from the intervention. Or I need permission to give a new drug to half my patients, but not to give it to all of them. Now, if you look at it that way, it does sound kind of strange. Why would we ever design rules that say something like that? And so the question is Truog right? Is it true that a physician could do almost anything they want in the name of therapeutic innovation, so long as they don't try to learn from what they're doing, which would, again, make this sound like a really stupid rule that's discouraging conducting good research? And I think the conclusion I'd like to convince you of is no, he's absolutely wrong about that. And the key to understanding why he and others who have made that argument are wrong is to understanding the ethical and legal rules that apply to those 3 categories that I told you about, and in particular to how they apply to that middle category, non-standard care. So let's look at that. And in particular, now let's look at the first 2 categories, standard care and non-standard care. And hopefully we could all agree that the general rule about the ethics of that type of thing, if you're in the clinical setting, is, and this goes back to, Hippocrates and the Hippocratic Oath. So this is thousands of years old, nothing all that new here. The patient is number 1, right? All of us as healthcare providers are always doing, except for really, really relatively small exceptions, doing things so that you prioritize the best interests of the patient. That's true both of standard care, and the key point I want to make here is it is also true of non-standard care. If you want to be in the clinical setting, not in the research setting, and you want to provide something that's a deviation from standard care, you're still bound by the rule that you have to do what's best for the patient. What happens if a doctor during clinical practice fails to follow that patient is number one rule? And this is pretty much true around the world in most legal systems. You're basically committing a type of negligence. You're committing malpractice. There are hugely serious implications for a practitioner when they do that. And the one thing you might ask yourself is, well, would it matter if the patient was told that, look, this is what the doctor's going to do? She's going to, deviate from the rule about just providing standard care and maybe doing things not in the best interest of the patient. And no, even if the patient said, okay, I'm good with that, no, in most legal systems, that is not going to be protecting the doctor from having committed malpractice. And I just give you a description here. You could sort of Google it of an extreme case in the US side of things. It involved a surgeon who actually wasn't even fully licensed in the US, but he actually did surgery on this woman who was very poor, and she couldn't afford to go to a hospital. He did surgery in her bedroom. It was horrible because afterwards, a few days later, she actually hemorrhaged to death in front of her teenage daughter. And again, this sounds incredibly extreme and horrible, which it was. But bottom line is, it's just an extreme example of consent isn't going to relieve the doctor of having committed malpractice. A patient in most legal systems isn't allowed to basically waive the protections that malpractice rules provide. Okay. So, in terms of when it is okay to provide non-standard care, well, again, remember the issue is you want to do this so it's in the best interest of the patient. Well, the way to do that is you ask, is it reasonable to depart from standard care? And in some cases it will be. I mean, right, there could be standard care isn't very good for certain patients based on their unique circumstances, their medical problem. And it could be that since standard care is not particularly good, it is in their interest for the physician to depart from standard care. But again, it's this reasonable test. You're going to compare the risks and benefits to the patient due to departing from standard care. Sometimes it's a good thing to depart, sometimes it isn't. But bottom line, you're still applying the patient is number one test, still applying basically the ethical rules that were devised thousands of years ago in terms of the Hippocratic Oath and the updated versions of that. So now let's transition. We've talked about standard care. We've talked about that middle category, non-standard care. Let's talk about research. And the key thing, from my take on this, and I think it really is useful in terms of then applying it to what we all do, is in the research setting, the key is that the patient is not number one. In fact, the rules are specifically designed to deal with that scenario where you as the physician can do things to the patient that are not necessarily in their best interests. And to give you an extreme example, the COVID-19 challenge trials. The whole nature of research is doing things to the patient that may not be in their best interests. So viewed correctly, you ask yourself, why do we have these rules regarding how to conduct research? And what we could understand in this take is that these rules actually are serving the interests of the researchers, as physicians. It's letting them do things they couldn't or otherwise do, because otherwise, if they were in standard care clinical setting or in a non-standard care clinical setting, they're still bound by the rule of doing what's in the best interest of the patient. Whereas if you're in the research setting, you actually are allowed to violate the patient is number one rule. And the trade-off for allowing them to conduct the research is we put in these other protections. We require all those protections that Dr. Trug was sort of complaining about. So understand all of this is basically in the name of allowing research to take place, because research is a good thing. We all benefit from what is learned from doing the research. So notice how this sort of take on things is very different from the conclusion from True's arguments, who say the research rules are instead an inappropriate administrative barrier. They're not an inappropriate administrative barrier. They're rather building in the protection we want to make sure we don't abuse patients too much by exposing them to too many risks. But the starting point is these rules are coming in because initially we're actually allowing the doctors to do things they otherwise couldn't do that might not be in the best interest of their patients. And this is just a slide that's explaining some of the things that doctors or any care provider is allowed to do in the research setting. They go beyond, again, that patient is number one rule, and common examples are randomization, standardization. You may be failing to individualize care in the way you would in the clinical setting, but in the research setting, you're allowed to do that because you want to eliminate the noise that would otherwise make it hard for you to compare the two randomized groups. You may perform additional tests or procedures that will in no way affect the patient's care, and they may even be possibly harmful to the patient, but you need them because it will generate information useful for your research, and maybe a failure to disclose interim results. So again, these are just examples of some of the things that are standardly done, regularly done in the research setting that may not be particularly good for the patient, that would have been violation of the patient is number one rule, but they're not violations when you do it in the research setting. And again, so that's why we have all these other protections to make sure these rules are not abused, that we do sufficiently protect the participant in the trials. Yeah, and this is just kind of summing that up, basically, right? That kind of, this is a trade-off. We allow the research to take place. We kind of weaken the patient as number one rule, and instead we build in all these research rules. Now, the question is, and this is sort of the heart of the talk here, sometimes it may be in the interest of a physician, depending on what their patient's problem is and depending on what the physician is trying to accomplish, to create an activity that puts them in the research category, so they're under these sort of innovative rules. But other times they may actually find it's in the best interest. It was in the introduction we were talking about, what sometimes clinicians do in Singapore and elsewhere. It may be in their interest actually to specifically be in that non-standard care category, and so I want to give you an example of that. And what Dr. R did is probably not a wonderful example in terms of really using category 2 in a good way, because I suspect most people would say he actually was doing something that probably may not meet the standard of having a good reason to deviate from the standard way to do a corneal transplant. Because the standard way to do a corneal transplant is actually pretty good. You get good results. And, just so you're going to save some, operating room time, that's not a good reason for a patient until the technique is proven to want to deviate, to expose themselves to some new technique there. Okay, so here's what I think is a better example of why you want to use that middle category. And it's another, ophthalmology example. As of 2005, the company Genentech was studying a new drug, Lucentis, as treatment for age-related macular degeneration. And it just so happened that same company already had another drug on the market, Avastin, which was actually the full-size antibody of which Lucentis actually happened to be a fragment. So it had both of these drugs. Lucentis was not yet approved, so it wasn't yet on the market. It was still being studied. And at this time, two prominent clinicians and many, or at least some of their colleagues, were at University of Miami, Bascom Palmer, an excellent ophthalmology institute, and they started using Avastin, which again was already marketed for other uses, not in ophthalmology, but they started using it off-label on numerous patients in a way of again trying to treat their ARMD. and they proposed down the road to do some future chart review to actually do research, but they viewed the chart review as just secondary analysis of data they collected clinically. And somebody complained to OHRP about this and said it was just like Dr. R, that we have these prominent physicians in this case doing research and they never ran it through an IRB. And the physicians basically the response, particularly Dr. Rosenfeld, responded to OHRP, in answering the complaint, said that no, there was secondary use of the data they collected clinically, but in terms of providing the treatment, actually giving this treatment to all those patients was clinical care. It was exactly that middle category too. It was a category of providing a non-standard treatment, and their claim was that that was perfectly okay because this would meet the reasonableness test. There weren't any other good ARMD treatments at the time. Lucentis was not yet on the market, so the patients couldn't get it, and that was their claim. And I think they actually had a better argument than Dr. R did as to why they wanted to do this. At that point, this was the only treatment they thought was actually probably going to be very, very good for their patients. And so they were giving it to them. Again, in that middle category, actually giving it to the patients was not research according to them. So, and there's a wonderful actually write-up of this by Dr. Rosenfeld, which if you're interested in it, you might want to kind of look up at some point. A more recent example, and it's interesting because I do think this is a good example of it, is in COVID and the early days of the pandemic. Imagine you were in New York City the summer of 2020, lots of COVID-19 patients, and there were no proven treatments at that point. And the physicians were trying off-label uses of steroids, anticoagulants. And there's a wonderful write-up of what was going on there in one particular medical center, Northwell Health, which is a huge medical center in the New York area. Susan Dominus wrote this up, very well worth reading if you're interested in this part of the history. And as she notes, it was COVID wars that were pitting doctor versus doctor. And what you had is the head of research, a physician at this medical center, complaining that some of his colleagues were actually not putting their patients in the trials or removing them from the clinical trials and were instead using the treatments off-label to treat the patients. And again, this was sort of a battle of which category is in your interest or in a particular patient's interest. Some of these doctors were saying, look, our patients are dying quickly, and we think the best thing to do is to do what we think is our best guess at this point and treat the patient with an off-label use of like a high dose of an anticoagulant instead of risking them, putting them in a randomized trial where they may get randomized to the less effective arm or the arm that they thought was less effective. So it's just showing you the thinking this way keeps popping up a lot of the time. Now, you may say there should be unique rules for a public health emergency, but then we have the broader issue of, okay, outside of a public health emergency, we could have the same issues kind of popping up. And so sort of thing to think about. Just want to point out some Singapore regulatory issues. There's a category called untested medical practices, and you don't have to read this right now. And then there's another category called innovative therapy that if you read those, you might think, well, that's going to make this type of middle category, providing non-standard care really, really small in Singapore. What I've learned from medical law experts in Singapore is that no, actually the rules about this medical category, legally speaking, are not all that different in the US than they are in Singapore, that physicians actually have a pretty broad ability to provide this kind of care. So, okay, now let me transition to the second part of the talk, and I want to talk a little bit about secondary use of data, secondary use of biospecimens. And I want to start out talking a little bit about one of your prior speakers in this series, Professor Pierce Keen, and he was talking about using AI in ophthalmology. And what he wanted to do was evaluate systemic disease in patients looking at retinal imaging. And he noticed this would require really big data. And here he's just telling you, you need maybe many millions of images. And so what he ended up doing was created a study, a system called Owl's Eyes. And the way he did this was he looked at patients over the age of 40 who had ophthalmic imaging at Moorfields, his hospital, and then merged that with a UK data bank. And the interesting thing was it took 250 million pounds to generate the UK biobank, but when he merged that with the ophthalmic imaging, all he needed was a grant of 15,000 pounds. He called it a biobank on a shoestring. And in his webinar, the amazing thing he then says after he tells you that is, now what I've told you is that it took us 4 years to get to permission to make this linkage. So it wasn't that it was hard technologically to merge the two sets, but to get the permissions to do this, sort of the rules I'm talking about in terms of the ethics and the regulatory approvals, that took 4 years. And so the question I would pose for Singapore is, what if you tried to do the sort of thing he was doing in the UK in Singapore? Let's assume you had two data banks, a broader data bank in Singapore and a narrow one from ophthalmology patients. When he merged his two databases, one of them was under a law that gave people an opt-out of research. So it allowed you to use all the data from the patients who hadn't opted out. And I don't know what the rules are here in Singapore, and others may want to comment during the questions. In Singapore, would consent be needed? Are there examples of people having already done this in Singapore? If the database only contained de-identified information, might you be able to do this without any consent at all because it's all de-identified and perhaps not under your rules? And finally, how long would it actually take to do this in Singapore? Not sure. Okay. Okay, now let me turn to another added factor here. Sometimes the kind of research you're going to want to do with AI, with big data sets, involves biospecimens because you want to use genomics. That's certainly cutting edge. And in the US, it just so happens to be the case that you're actually allowed, you have traditionally been allowed to do that with a de-identified biospecimen without consent. In Singapore, you actually have a lot of detailed rules that actually don't allow you to do that. You need consent for this sort of stuff. Okay. So there was actually a proposed change while I was running this US agency about, well, maybe we should get consent. And it was very, very controversial. And the rationale, and we don't have to go through all this, was basically saying that people actually want to be asked whether or not, you could use their biospecimen. And if we don't ask them, they're going to be angry at us and they're going to shut down research and not agree to funding of it. And that's just a bad thing. Okay. Well, the proposal ended up ultimately being rejected. So the rule in the US is still that you don't need consent for that sort of thing. And Stanford in particular wrote a public comment that argued strongly in favor of rejecting the change and basically said that, look, just because you think people think this, maybe people actually would be fine with continuing with the current rule. They really want the research to take place. And they also said, if you actually impose a consent rule, you're actually going to harm the weakest people, the poorest people, the minority, because they're the ones that are going to go to institutions that are not going to ever do this kind of research. So you just won't learn how to change treatments to benefit them. So this would be a very, very bad thing to do. Does this have any applicability to Singapore? As Singapore moves forward with more and more research, are you going to have issues about that you're going to run into some of the problems that Stanford thought would happen in the US if you got consent? Or maybe this isn't an issue in Singapore. And maybe, in fact, the viewpoint of the citizens of Singapore is more clearly, yes, they always would want consent in terms of that. And I don't know. And I don't know that this has actually been studied. It would be interesting to see, what the people of Singapore actually think about this sort of thing. Let's see. And I only have a few little things to say here. Oh, and this is just pointing out, there's actually a recent Washington Post article suggesting, and I'm not sure how true this is, that China might actually be doing a lot of research with biospecimens without consent, because during the pandemic, one of its companies was, providing services that helped, do research relating to the pandemic, and maybe that information is going to the Chinese government. Just sort of interesting, all these interesting issues here, and highly relevant to this part of the world. And I just want to say a little bit about, in terms of the underlying ethical thinking about, well, should we or should we not get consent when we do this kind of secondary research with biospecimens? The head of my department here, the Center for Biomedical Ethics, Julian Savulescu, a really famous, world-renowned bioethicist, he wrote an article about this very issue, back in 2015, and basically what he says, it's okay to not get consent for things all the time, particularly when what you're getting consent for isn't that important to the person you're asking, whereas the benefit to society, doing beneficence, a big thing in bioethics, is much, much more important, okay? So he's basically saying, look at all the wonderful things we could do if we were allowed to do more research with discarded tissue, exactly what we're talking about here. And as he goes on to say, there is a moral imperative to perform good research and not impede it. And if you delay by 1 year development of a treatment that cures a lethal disease that kills 100,000 people, you're basically responsible for the deaths of those 100,000 people. So this is a pretty strong, comment from a major bioethicist that, maybe sometimes we don't need to get consent. So a bottom line, don't assume because you're just doing a good thing by protecting autonomy, by implementing all this consent, that you are doing the most ethical thing. Maybe you're doing just the opposite. You're doing something bad by slowing down our ability to save hundreds of thousands of lives. Let me see, I want to allow question time here or something. Okay, so this slide, just very briefly, is about IRBs as policymakers. And this is an interesting take in terms of, on the US side, when IRBs go and do things that go beyond just reviewing a research study and deciding if it's approvable or not, people often worry about so-called mission creep, that this isn't something that the IRB should be doing. My sense is that in the Singapore way of doing things, IRBs actually have more authority, and that gets back to, well, how does that compare sort of the US take on things? Again, another issue about what things might be more subject to some degree of flexibility, even in Singapore, figuring out ways to kind of tweak some of the rules that the IRBs are setting. And I have one final point. I wanted to sort of end talking about cluster randomized trials. This is where you don't randomize each participant, flip a coin for each participant, but instead randomize on some other broader unit, such as different hospitals, are assigned to different arms in the trial. And these trials can often be really important in terms of doing certain types of public health research you can't do a different way. And some of them in the US, you have rules that allow, again, eliminating waiving informed consent sometimes if the trial is minimal risk. Singapore doesn't have that type of rule. And so the question is, are some of those trials important to conduct, yet may not be doable, even under more liberal rules? And in particular, is there a role for cluster randomized trials in Singapore? And just to give you an example, again, sticking with eyecare, I found this particular trial because so much cutting edge work is being done in terms of myopia treatments these days. So here's a trial from Taiwan only a few years ago. That was a cluster randomized trial. They ended up having students in schools spend more time outside. And in this case, they actually were able to get consent. But I suspect some people in myopia field may be thinking of trials they'd love to do that they couldn't do this if they needed to get consent. So I think this is the end of my part of it. And I just want to note, I was brought to Singapore, to NUS, to work on issues relating to clinical trials, secondary use of data, biospecimens. So I love working with people to figure out ways to kind of work within the rules. So if anybody works in these areas, here's my email. Reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. And I guess I'll stop sharing and hand it back to you guys.
Thank you very much, Prof. Jerry. It is a fantastic talk, and it is really no mean feat to summarize the history of research ethics principles in a short 40-minute talk, which I think you've done a fantastic job. I would like to summarize that, you very nicely helped us simplify, or at least partially simplify, patient care into three groups: standard care, non-standard care, and research care, of which that it's very useful for me personally. For those who have joined us a bit later, I'd like to introduce our panel again. We have Professor Jerry, who is the Professor of Bioethics in the Center of Biomedical Ethics, also in the Department of Ophthalmology and Senior Fellow in the Faculty of Law at the National University of Singapore. I also am joined by my panelist, Dr. Marcus Tan, who is a consultant ophthalmologist and also the Deputy Chief Technology Officer from the NUHS cluster working in digital transformation for our department. Myself, I'm a consultant ophthalmologist who is the co-lead of Pillar 2, that is community eye care, where we try to bring devices for community care ophthalmology. So the chat box is free for you to type questions, and please feel free to ask. I will start the ball rolling. Prof. Jerry, you mentioned in your examples, Dr. Rosenfeld using Avastin in an off-label kind of manner for Lucentis, and perhaps in his scenario, it was actually painted as a non-standard care. I was just wondering if subsequently we have decided that, hey, this group of treatment is actually pretty good. Could we then go back to the group of patients with asking them to do a retrospective consent to try to publish this data and then formally do this as a clinical trial? Is this appropriate, or would this raise questions on why you did this as a non-standard care in the first place?
Okay, so good question. You couldn't recharacterize what originally happened. I mean, if indeed it was originally a clinical trial, then you would have needed IRB approval at the outset. So you can't retroactively get IRB approval after you did something that perhaps really was a clinical trial. I mean, the if you want to call it the beauty of what they ended up doing and being able to convince the regulator, OHRP, that their take was acceptable, was that they were claiming it wasn't a clinical trial, because again, the moment you conclude it was a clinical trial, if it was a clinical trial, it should have been treated as a clinical trial, and you shouldn't have been able to do it without IRB approval. You would have been exactly in the dilemma that Dr. R was in if he was indeed doing a clinical trial. And they still ended up being able to use data. What they had done was basically, he said, look, the only thing they had to recharacterize or correctly characterize was actually providing the Avastin to the patients. They were basically saying, when we gave the treatments to the patients, that was not research. We were doing it because we concluded that act of giving them that treatment was consistent with clinical care. It was not standard clinical care. It was innovative, but it was a reasonable deviation from standard care at that point. And I'm also not aware, again, we're back in the US for that anybody got sued about that, because certainly if bad things had happened to those patients, you would have had lawyers like immediately trying to find them and bring lawsuits. And there was a lawsuit brought against Dr. R in that scenario. So you wouldn't want to try to recharacterize this. Basically, the characterization that they ended up having accepted by the US government was one that met all their needs. They ended up doing a secondary analysis of all the data from those patients. So we did learn from what happened to them. It was just done in terms of, again, just a secondary analysis of data, not claiming that the actual provision of the treatment was on the research side of things.
That's clear. Yep. Sorry.
Question. Thank you for the great talk. Very thought-provoking, and definitely raised many more questions along with the answers. But I have one question. One of the special considerations of the patient-doctor relationship is the inherent knowledge asymmetry between patient and doctor. We have a rather clearly defined legal standard to judge what is material and relevant information that's given to the patient. When we talk about clinical research, what would that standard be? Should it be a higher standard that is imposed by the ethics board And do you think we are there yet in terms of what the IRB imposes generally on investigators?
Yeah, another great question. I mean, I love consent issues. That's actually the heart of what I do. I spend a lot of time thinking about consent issues. And I was talking in my talk about that period during which we were considering changing the US regulations. We actually did change them in a variety of ways. And I think the most important change was one that I pushed for relating to what the content is of consent and how consent forms are written, which includes putting the key information in consent at the very front of a consent form, because lots of people, consent forms are long these days, and a lot of, research participants, kind of say, okay, doc, just enroll me in the trial. I can't read this long form or something. Whereas if the first 1 or 2 pages really start saying, this is what really matters, you should at least read this, you'll do a much better job. But I do think the rules in general in consent in the research setting are pretty good about actually spelling out a lot of the information that the person needs, and requiring at least a document that actually is unique to that research study, and exactly what Bob True was complaining about. You need to really spell this out, because we want to be careful to make sure that the research participant knows what they're getting into. We do require, detailed information about risks, benefits, alternatives, a description of what's going to happen to the person in the study. The other important element of, I'll talk about the US changes again, is that in addition to putting that stuff, key information at the beginning of the form, you now have to do a better job of putting the pieces together. Just telling somebody about risks, benefits, alternatives often can still be confusing. Complicated medical care is confusing. That's why it's hard for people to make good decisions, even on the clinical side. On the research side, it even gets more complicated because we're talking about treatments that we're not sure whether or not they work, or we're not sure about the full extent of their side effects and things like that. So what the new rules on the US side require are basically, you actually have to put the pieces together and explain how the risks, benefits, and alternatives fit together, and how for people with certain types of values and certain types of goals in enrolling in the research trial, why that may or may not be leading them to make an appropriate decision that I should be in this trial or I shouldn't be in this trial. So, and that probably sounds unduly complicated the way I describe it, but that is a key change that is still being implemented, and still people are interpreting what the regulations really require there. But it is sort of about, can we do a better job? Yes. Do we already do a not bad job? Yes. But let's work on particularly, again, the most complicated trials, doing an even better job to make people understand better. So, for example, not uncommon, in fact, almost unheard of, that a consent form would explain the reasons why maybe you shouldn't be in the trial. And they won't do that because in many ways it's still sort of a sales document, that it's like, okay, we'll tell you about all these horrible risks and what might happen to you, but we're still giving you this form because we really want you to enroll in the trial. So it won't have a section, here's maybe why you don't want to enroll in the trial. But a great issue.
Thank you.
Prof, there are a couple of questions coming in from the Q&A. So one of the participants asked, how could we ensure that non-standard care does not necessarily or eventually harm the patients unnecessarily, as it is not essential to inform the authorities?
Yeah. Okay. Another good question. And again, I'm certainly not the expert in terms of exactly what happens in terms of Singapore, but right, it's not uncommon, and I suspect in certain institutions in Singapore, basically you do create some sort of analogous system like the IRB system, but for non-standard care, whether it's through committees. And of course, you do have the rules, which I cited right from the Singapore Medical Council, which, depending on how you parse out those two sets of rules that I described to you, those will in fact, be barriers to deviations that go somewhat too far. So again, a lot of this is sort of how you draw the lines, and that's a lot of our lives are about line drawing and exactly where lines show up. But certain types of deviations from standard care will run afoul of what the innovative care, provision from the Singapore Medical Council and the other provision. Others will be picked up because, right, your major hospitals, other institutions will impose their own criteria saying, if you're on our medical staff and you want to provide non-standard care, here's what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to tell us about it. We may run it through a committee, that sort of thing. So all of this is part of the complicated system we have for dealing with all of those three categories: standard care, non-standard care, and research. And absolutely, bad things can happen in research. We certainly don't want people being exposed to too risky things, perhaps like what Dr. R did. So I'm sure there are lots of systems, right, in Singapore, as in many other countries. Yeah.
Thank you. And certainly, I suppose the bottom line is that there is always an informed consent process where the physician tries to explain all the components of that non-standard treatment to the patient to ensure they are on the board as well.
There certainly is, although this gets back to the one thing we don't want to forget about is there is a paternalism character to these sets of rules that even if the person gives consent, like I was telling you about the guy doing surgery in the bedroom, that's not going to be enough for some scenarios. There are things that we consider to be too risky that even if a person would consent to that, we're not going to necessarily allow them to consent to that. So again, different components, consent aspects of it, absolutely. I totally agree with you, actually, that consent is the biggest protection, but there are also some degree of protection brought in by not allowing a person to consent to certain things that we have, for other reasons, determined they shouldn't even be allowed to be exposed to those risks.
Absolutely. Prof, we have time for one last question. So
okay.
Andrew is asking whether there have been any studies surveying how many people, for example, how many ophthalmologists commonly perform non-standard care and what they believe are barriers to such treatments. Does this differ between governing bodies and countries? Are you aware?
Yeah, I don't know about across many countries. I'm still new in Singapore. I only got here in January. I do know on the U.S. side, and again, I have less specific information relating to ophthalmologists or optometrists, eye care providers. But in general, there is a huge amount of non-standard care in the US in terms of pharmaceuticals and things like that. The standard take is that probably billions of, I think it's right, billions of prescriptions are written each year in ways that would not constitute non-standard care. And US physicians consider their authority to provide non-standard care as very, very important in terms of doing what's best for the patients. I have no reason to think this is hugely different in other countries. And again, my initial, what I was hearing from, again, at least one medical league expert was that, in fact, yes, in Singapore, the way you kind of think about these concepts from the legal viewpoint isn't all that different than the US side of it. So just my guess would probably be there's a fair amount of, you have ophthalmologists or physicians in Singapore. You want to do what's best for your patient. It is often the case that patients are different. And, a lot of ophthalmology is doing surgery, that it is even more so for surgeons that each patient is almost unique, right? So you're tweaking the surgery in one or another, maybe minor way when you encounter a patient. In some patients, it may be more than minor. So it's almost like this N of one, right? They're all unique, and therefore you're actually applying exactly these concepts almost every time you kind of take out a cataract or whatever else. So it's a great issue. And for people if people have questions and we can't answer them now, feel free to email me. I mean, I like talking about this stuff or something.
Thank you very much, Prof. It's been a very elucidating 1 hour for us. There are still some questions on our Q&A, but in the interest of time, we will probably collate them and email to you. For the participants,
very good.
We can reach out to you separately after this. Okay. And at this point, I would like to share our upcoming webinar, which very nicely segues from today's talk. It's on the detection of diseases and systemic biomarkers in photos of external eyes. We have a speaker, Professor Liu Yun from Stanford, who will be hosted by Professor Cheng Cheng Yu, our director for the Center for Innovation and Precision Eye Health. So please mark your calendars and sign up if you're available. This will be our last webinar for this calendar year. Our next one will actually be in January. And so we can all have a good Christmas break. So once again, thank you everyone. And for those in the Asia Pacific, have a very good evening. And oh, sorry, I have one more slide. Yeah, thanks for reminding. There is a feedback form for the participants. Please, if you don't mind, take some time, scan the QR code to give us our webinar feedback for webinar, letting us know how we can do better, whether the content is relevant, and what are the areas that we have perhaps done well and can improve on. So once again, if no one has last questions, I would like to thank my panelists, Professor Jerry, Dr. Marcus Tan, and all the audience who joined us today. I wish you a very good evening from those in the Asia Pacific and a good rest of the day for the rest of the world. Thank you very much.